start out by sketching your basic image. Here I sketched the face multiple times just to get the hang of it until I felt that it looked right, and I recorded that sketching process as a script and played back that script later at a much larger size in order to begin my new painting. I do recommend sketching stuff multiple times because you learn as you go, and it's always much better the third or fourth time you draw something. And sometimes you can start out by just tracing it just to learn the shape of something based on a reference, and then resketch it a few times until it becomes yours. I'm using a completely textureless canvas for this image with no texture at all. And the blue lines across the screen are guides which were added in ArtRage 5. So they're helping me track where the facial features should be, because the middle of the eye should line up with the corners of the mouth, that sort of thing. Without that visual guideline, it's very easy for an eye or something to just start wandering out of place, and then it's just a pain to fix it up later. You can see the pencil settings on the screen. The most important things there are the pressure and the noise. Noise is what adds that nice textury pencil effect, and I keep it around 80 to 100% for sketching, and then I drop it down to 20 to 40% for shading, because the more dispersed it is, the lighter the stroke you're getting, so it gets harder to add shading easily at a high noise. It's very important to get the details right, which is eyes, mouth and nose, and block out all the shadowy areas that you're going to want to use later on in the image. Now I just added a new layer to start painting in, blocking in the watercolor paint itself. I have set all my layers to the watercolor blend mode. So what I did with that to create them easily was I created an empty layer, changed the blend mode, and then duplicated that layer a few times. So you can just see the blend mode icon on the layers over on the right. I'm starting with colouring the eyes because it just helps me see what I'm doing a bit more easily when I add the skin behind it. And when you first start colouring a face in, it often can look pretty strange, and it makes it harder to see what you're aiming for in the end. So adding a bit of facial structure at the beginning, like the eyes, makes it a bit easier. Here I'm just adding some basic shadows. And my process for colouring with the watercolour tool generally is just to block out an area of colour with paint and add the shadows and the highlights in roughly, and then shade it with the hard wet palette knife preset. This blends it all together nicely. When I want more subtle highlights and shadows, I add a new layer, or I turn on Insta Dry, and then I increase the thinners and just lay up very thin watery strokes. This is also a good way to just lower low opacity strokes over sharper edges and just sort of build up a bit of a blending effect. Now I've switched to a new layer to do the skin. I've turned paper wet on and used a very high loading setting. This lets me get a lot of solid colour down very quickly. Now ideally you would start with the shadows and add the highlights on a new layer, then blend them together, but I'm going to be messing around a lot and experimenting with the way the paint blends and learning the shape of the colours and the face, because I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this yet. So now I'm blocking the lips on another layer for the same reason I added the eyes earlier. I need them there to help me see what shape the face should be and where the shadows should be and everything. And I don't think I'm going to keep them like this, because there's too many things that are going to change and I'm just muddling along as I go right now. But they will be enough to help me figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. So again, I'm blocking it out with some very solid colour and high loading, and then I'm going to blend in some wet paint into the colour, and then I'm going to add another layer and experiment with the highlights and shadows with much higher thinners. And this will let me add a bit of detail and shape to the lips, which will make it a bit easier for me to see the face I'm trying to create. If you dab around with very high thinners, you can get some very interesting texture effects. Okay, now I've added highlights on a separate layer here for the face, and I've added them as big solid washes of colour and blended everything to soften it with the wet palette knife. Then I'm starting to add much thinner washes with very high thinners on another layer to help define the face a bit better. Now I'm adding a hair layer, which is just a big dark wash to give me a backdrop and let me start experimenting with different effects. I'm softening it with the hard wet preset again to see what it's going to look like. The hard wet preset is a good way to get bleeds and fade effects. Again, I don't know if I'm going to be keeping this. Now here I need to be able to show the body and shape of the hair, but I also want to use watercolor effects, and watercolor is generally quite flat, so I'm layering different textures and blends and increasing the density and darkness the closer into her head I get. I'm using darker colours than my original reference image's skin because it's much easier to add highlights later if I need to, and it's very easy to go too light with the midtones if you're working with a skin colour that you don't normally work with. This tends to be a common problem with painting darker skin. People tend to just automatically shift lighter and lighter, trying to make it easier to see the face. I'm going back to the face. Here I'm just building up new layers and continuing to blend, and I'm not going about this in an efficient way because I keep going back and redoing the same areas. I also forgot to turn the real colour blending back on, so the colour isn't always doing what I expect it to. And of course sometimes watercolour just works better the more you blend and add to it. I'm back on the hair and I'm just experimenting with different levels of the thinner and blending out any of the really obvious paint strokes. And now I'm adding a bit more definition around the face with dark strokes. I'm adding a thin dark wash to build up more shadows and definition, and then I'm removing it because I messed up my layers and I painted it on the hair layer, which makes it really hard to go back later and edit it. So I have to redo them all, and then I block out all the shadows and highlights again so that I can start blending them again together later. So I went over going over everything with the wet palette knife again, and again redoing an extra layer of highlights. And now I'm going to add some paint drips. Paint drips are covered in a different tutorial, and there's a link in the video description. But the important thing here is to draw out the shape of your drips and then go over them later with higher thinners. And a sort of a medium colour bleed, and then occasionally go over it with a palette knife to fade or smudge an area. The colour bleed is quite important because it controls how much of the existing paint is washed away when you go over it. I'm repainting the lips again, and I'm picking new colours and lighting effects to match the rest of the face better. I'm layering the solid wet paint again and just laying down basic areas of colour. Basically I'm redoing them from scratch. The shading of the whole face is going to affect the lip shape, and the shape of the lips is going to affect the entire expression of the face, which means it's quite important to go over them towards the end when you know what your face is actually going to look like. I'm also adding the shadows and highlights on a separate layer because every time I blend or mix them up, I don't want to mess up the colour I've already added. And the closer I get to finishing, the thinner the paint I use and the less dramatic the shading and blending I use, because I don't want to undo all the work I've already done. And again, I'm softening all the edges with the palette knife slightly. For the nose and final highlights, I'm using quite a thin, defined amount of paint strokes. And then once I've added those strokes, I just sort of blend the edges back into the existing paint. Adding that final layer of detail and definition around the edges of everything can make a huge difference in how finished your image looks. For a background wash, I'm adding just multiple washes of colour and playing around with the palette knife and different strokes to get a variety of effects. I'm adding another series of drips in the background for a sort of a watercolor rain drip effect. I'm repeating what I did with the drips that are coming off the hair. I'm laying down a solid drip shape, and then I'm washing away the inside with a brush using high thinners. And there's no absolute right way to do this, it's just a matter of playing around, continuing to blend and wash colours out. But the trick here is to get as much variation as possible, so you want to keep changing things. Different colour bleeds, different amounts of thinners, even different colours. I've erased more of the pencil sketch as I work, so it's no longer over the entire image, but I'm leaving some of it in there because I painted around it, so it's actually part of the painting now. But I reduced the opacity so it's less prominent. And just keep touching up the drips. And it's very tempting to blend everything away when you're working digitally, and I'm trying not to do that because that defeats the whole point of working with the watercolours. And just touch up the final shadows and corners and leave it at that.